this year.
Wow. I know when you said the last one. I thought Shrek 3 was broken, still it's gonna win. I thought that was the one.
3 is when Donkey has the dragon babies.
Donkey has the dragon babies and goes to Sarah. I thought that is the second. Or about this guy.
Yeah, okay. See, this is why you just go with the classic first one. Like, you know Shrek is small, right?
Yeah, Shrek 1's, yeah, classic, right? You know it's good, right? There are 5 now?
I think that's a lot.
I mean, I'm kind of not surprised because like the original one was a while ago, right?
Okay, so those are series made up. Okay, there's the Shrek in the second, the Shrek, and then Forever After. So there's
All right.
Okay, we got it.
Got Shrek figured out? We're good now? Okay.
Shrek the Halls.
All right. How you guys doing? Ready for some Shrek? Huh? Okay. This morning I had a nice call with our going to be the kind of the group leads, sort of Brian and Caroline down in Nicaragua for us. They're the ones I've mentioned that have been working down there on the water projects in particular. Probably have one or maybe both of them Zoom in at some point to talk a little bit about what's happening down there. So I've got a bit of an update perhaps on that. And so maybe I'll have any Nicaragua travelers hang back for 5 minutes at the end of class, touch base on a couple things. But okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say for everyone at the moment. So be looking forward to that. Last time we left off kind of talking about the difficulties of this, what we might call a Pareto distribution, where some form of prosperity, that might be wealth, that might be, it definitely is sort of driven by opportunity. You could even think about the opportunity that people have. However we conceptualize it, this is a kind of a naturally occurring thing, and there's clear issues with it when people are impoverished, especially if there are the societal systems in place cater to that, right? So we'd rather societal systems that try to prevent this or to limit the impact, especially if it's a matter of taking from down here. There's certainly just going to be natural forces there with positive feedback loops, but we were talking about, okay, can we shift this thing up or right, or how can we leverage this? And another thing that I didn't really mention was perhaps we can apply leverage to one side of it, right? So we don't care as much if the left side increases further, they're already doing quite well. Maybe we focus our efforts, right? So all of those types of things are considerations. So kind of calling back to one of the topics or one of the things I mentioned before, the Copenhagen Consensus Institute, or whatever its name is, and Bjorn Lomborg just released this book called Best Things First. And so if we take a look, this might be a little hard to see, but this is a table. I don't think it's ordered in value necessarily, but you can see there are values listed over here. This is a benefit to cost ratio. That's not how you spell benefit. So basically, how much benefit do you get per dollar you spend, kind of thing. And so there's a good list here, and you can see the higher the number, the more benefit you get for having invested in that. So investing into trade, even just thinking back about our mental thought process about the community of 1,000 people that are isolated versus 10,000 that are isolated. Well, trade is a way to de-isolate them, right? And thinking about what that could do for prosperity. And we talked about, division of labor type things, specialization, things that you can end up becoming more productive. And by the way, one of the things I also meant to talk about here is one potential good thing about having people that are in this sector is if they are also very productive with their resources. So if you can invest $1 million and you can return more money than you can if you could invest $1,000, right? Even just by interest. So there, if we can leverage that as, an example, you might say, well, maybe Bill Gates or Elon Musk or something, if they can do productive things for society as part of what they're doing, that could be partly a good thing, right? Setting aside for a moment the issues that we face with inequalities, right? If there's somebody capable of being more productive with that could, so that's also possibly a tie-in with trade. So anyway, there's quite a lot of things, nutrition, malaria prevention, maternal and newborn health, tuberculosis, other chronic disease, childhood immunizations, education, agricultural R&D, and probably a lot of training there too. As we think about Nicaragua a lot this semester, we'll find or we'll recognize that a lot of times what they'll do is they'll have sugarcane and then swap it with peanuts to kind of recharge, do some nitrogen fixation. So if they didn't know to do that, and I'm guessing at some point that was somebody taught them or they learned that somehow, that growing peanuts, which do a nitrogen fixation quite effectively, and then tilling that back into the soil helps re-nourish the soil with nitrogen. So you'll deplete the soil by your typical agriculture, take all that organic matter away, so you've just stripped all those nutrients out, and just even tilling the land and all that is required takes a lot of stuff out of the soil. So a way to kind of recharge it, replenish it, is quite important. So things like that might be the type of intervention you might see that actually has a pretty good outcome. It looks like e-procurement. I'm not even sure exactly what that's talking about. Perhaps that's access to purchasing things online. That apparently is a high benefit. And that actually makes a lot of sense if there's limits to transportation. It's kind of surprising to think lately, but access to cell phones, in the recent decade is a lot more common and perhaps a lot more affordable than reliable transportation, in fact. So like a car or motorcycle type thing. Okay, so good spot to look. I wanted to highlight that as a table of types of things to look at, and that people are working towards establishing some sort of cost-benefit ratio, or in this case, benefit to cost ratio. And you might think to yourself, okay, well, I've been concerned about this particular topic. Where would that fall, or perhaps what efforts towards that would fall there? And in particular, one thing that comes to mind, and I think Bjorn Longborg makes the same point. He expresses concern about climate, but also concerns about how people are going about trying to solve that problem, right? And so, as we are about to talk about the moral foundations and things, if we are able to take a pause there and think critically about it, limiting carbon emissions, if our concerns are specifically towards saving people's lives and improving and getting good value for our investments, limiting people's energy consumption is probably not as good of an intervention as preparing people to face climate-related challenges, right? So in that sense, helping people to prosper tends towards better outcomes in that manner. So there's a lot to consider there. I said, I just breezed through that really quickly, but it's good to think about all of the costs and all of the benefits, right? And I think it's really easy for us to see a startling issue or see a scary issue and, coming to the sacralization, how did they say it? Sacralization? To make something sacred or to hold it as sacred. If we're doing that, we could lose sight of the fact that, limiting people from keeping their houses warm or for traveling to get clean water or something could be a major harm, right? So it's good to be thinking about it in depth and to look for resources that can do that. So that was kind of the tail end of last time's slides. I'll get these posted. I don't think I have done so just yet for most of our slides. Okay. All right, so I want to talk next about kind of ethical considerations of intervention and tie in the those moral foundations here as well. All right. So as we think about some problem in a developing country, some water problem or the like, these are a couple pictures I took, first couple trips I took to Nicaragua. This is, I think I might have showed you early this semester. That's basically wastewater discharge through a landfill. So it's a really, really toxic, hazardous situation, and people are have direct exposure to that, even children, and that's not a good situation. And down here is a active gold mine. I don't know if it's still active, but it's gold mining operation where they are using mercury and trying to amalgamate the gold out of soil from there, and it's unregulated. So there's a lot of illicit operations, meaning the government hasn't given any sort of approval or any sort of limit on permitting or regulations. So it's pretty clear that they are potentially harming the local environment, potentially polluting water supplies and things like that. Okay, so we see something. Well, first of all, we might think to ourselves, well, what exactly is wrong with a particular situation? And I highlighted a couple examples here, but what do you think? What kinds of things have you seen, or I don't know if you've taken a look at the topic list yet? Anything motivating you in particular yet, in terms of seeing something that's wrong or unfortunate, or what comes to mind? And by the way, the Google Doc should now be, everybody should be able to edit it. There was an issue the first couple that tried. Any inspiration yet? Okay, I'll make you talk in a minute. But so that might just be our first question. We say, okay, well, we find something that's wrong, gold mining, the wastewater discharge, and all that. And then the next question is, okay, we found something, and, we have something that we identify. Then, well, the next question is kind of how can we help? And a question you might or might not think about is, should we help? Right? Do you ever have that situation in your own life where you see, maybe it's somebody struggling, maybe it's a hurting animal or something, and you ask you kind of see something that's wrong, and then you want to help, but should you? Have you ever encountered that? Sometimes it might be somebody's stuck on the side of the road, or looking for a ride, or looking for financial help or something, and there's kind of a question sometimes, like, or a tension there. And I think it's a good question, and an important question, because the answer can't always be yes to should you help, right? Where would that go, right? There'd be no end to it so long as you have your eyes open to see problems, right? And then there'd be no more you left because you've given all of yourself away. So how do we manage that? Do you manage that? What do you do when you have that tension?
I'm just thinking about if I see someone on the side of the road, I'm like, oh, I wish I could help them, but I'm a little girl all by myself. I'm not picking them up; they would kill me.
Right.
So I just won't help.
Yeah. So there's an element of self-preservation there for sure, and nobody would blame you for that, right? Yeah. And even you'll see on the sides of the roads, intersections lately, you'll see signs encouraging drivers not to give handouts to people panhandling, asking for money, because there are shelters in place and it gives instructions on, where people can go for that. But at the very minimum, to keep traffic flowing properly and ensure safety like that. So, but it still feels like a tension there, right? It's like, oh, I could help maybe, or I wish I could help, or something, right? There's often something there. So another question is, how do we know it would actually help? So again, with the panhandlers, perhaps what somebody needs is exactly $10 to fix their current problem. But it's also the case that sometimes the people that are really in poverty aren't the ones out there panhandling, so we just don't see them, but there are people that really could use that $10, and this person is just going to go buy some drugs. That's possible, or alcohol, or whatever. And I'm not saying that's true for all of them, but I know that's a problem. And when I was in college, I volunteered a few times at a homeless shelter where they were pretty adamant that like the least helpful thing you can do is give out money, and this is in Atlanta proper, and that is because that's not something that would bring them any kind of agency over their own life or developing any sort of ownership towards a better track, right? Most people who are engaged in that context, they were needing dignity for one, and needing a way to progress their own lives, right? And the panhandling was often not actually geared towards that. So in all of that, we can kind of step back and say, well, how would we define success in lending help, right? And thinking of all that. So, by this point in the class, I hope that we've poked a lot of different moral foundations in terms of like, oh, I always thought of that a little differently, or that seems to be really, really important, but you're kind of saying something against how I felt about it, or something, right? So I went through and I was looking at your responses to our moral foundations participation assignment, and first and foremost, I thought you were all quite profound with what you shared about your own assessment of things. So thank you. That was fantastic, and I really appreciate that you took the time to do that and to think about that. And it looked like a lot of you also liked that exercise to think about that. And a lot of you were saying, "Oh yeah, hadn't really thought of it in that manner. I can kind of see that." Or maybe it's like tying it into, yeah, this is what motivates me here, or yeah, here's what I tend to hold sacred, and here's I think why. So that was really neat to see. And I'll say that I respect each and every one of your perspectives there, and that was something really neat. I might, I probably should ask you. Would definitely anonymize it, but I might share what you all wrote in some sense. If I do that, I'm gonna like make sure it's not clear who you were or whatever. But part of me wants to do that just simply so you can see. Some of you wrote some excellent. I mean, I limited it to 300 words, right? So you couldn't go too long, but I thought it was quite profound. It was like very insightful. So good for you all, and I hope that that your classmates have deep thoughts on all of this, right? And things that I think we had people taking almost everything here. I don't think authority came out very much, and I guess they're all in some ways tied into one another. But there was quite a variety and quite a lot of good reasons and thinking on that. So kudos to that. Anybody want to share something in particular that you thought about or thought differently about, or any of that? I'll put you on the spot and read out your answers. No. You'll never participate again.
So I kind of believe in like absolutes, like for the fairness and cheating foundation. Like, say you've been having a really bad day, you have a lot of stuff going on, like just nothing seems to be going your way, and at the end of the day, your good friend like pokes fun at you, and it's just like the last thing that might set you off the edge to explode. But if you're being fair, you have to think of it from his perspective. It's like they'll always poke fun at each other. It's nothing like new. It's like you have to look at it from a fair point of view. Like play the devil's advocate. You're in his shoes. He doesn't know what you went through today, so you have to treat him in his perspective. Like, he doesn't know that you went through all that today, so you have to like treat him fairly. every situation you should treat it as it belongs to you, is how I think of it.
Yeah. So fairness in the sense of being fair to others, and appreciating, uh, giving them a fair chance at their interactions with you, right?
Right, and
Something like that.
looking at things through their lens, is the fair way to do things.
Yeah. Another thing that I noticed a lot of you commented on was some aspect of empathy being important in this. And that came from any of these foundations. And that's kind of what you're saying right there, is like having the ability to kind of step into their shoes, or at least recognize the way they're seeing something might be a bit different, right? I like that. What else? Anyone else find anything challenging about it, or find anything? Yeah.
In the video, I watched this like 2 weeks ago, so I
Yeah.
I think it was interesting overall, but I feel like when discussing some of these tenets, he kind of makes some generalizations and didn't really mention or take into account that there is a lot of gray areas with all of these. That was one thing that kind of stood out to me, because I was like, I mean, you can't just say this and that. It's not that simple.
Right.
But I also said that like care versus harm was probably like my most sacred value, and I think it probably is for a lot of us, like, to care about the environment and an empathetic feel.
Right. Yeah. So there's a couple things there. One is he might be addressing a little bit more of the extreme ends of things, right? So when these go really wrong is when somebody's being really extreme with it. So like Michael, you said you're thinking absolutes, but I that feels not like the normal absolute that I'm thinking of. I feel like some people treat these with absolutes in terms of like, you must not harm anybody. You must always be caring, right? So if you go to an extreme with an absolute, and I don't think that's not how I understood yours to be. I think that extreme sacredness, like if you don't treat people with fairness, then you are in trouble, kind of thing, right? So it's like some extreme end of it, I think, is probably more the context where he was trying to address in terms of like, okay, what are the big problems, or like how do we understand where these big contentions are coming from, right? That's kind of how I took it. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of generalization there. Anytime we're going to categorize how you feel this way, you're motivated by that, to put you in that box, that's generalizing, right? Or putting ourselves in the boxes, right? Yeah, and a lot of you shared about different topics that were concerning to you. Some of it was class, some of it was current events, some of it was other things, and I really appreciated that. So, I gave a little reflection myself. I think I tend to appreciate liberty, and perhaps a little bit of the authority aspect. And I don't know if that might just simply mean that I think there's some importance to having the appropriate type of structure to society, or something that's not tyrannical, but it's also that earns enough respect to function. And that could be at this level of like, an individual, even just with their dealings with their neighbors or whatever. So I'm not like, I find myself rebelling against authority more often than than like wanting it, but or rules or something, but I think I have some sort of value there, probably in tandem with that. And kind of what you mentioned about even just this class, Lauren, like our subject matter, people probably, we might see generalizations come out about what type of moral foundations would a classroom full of environmental engineers care about, right? We could categorize a lot of different classes, and there's probably going to be some generalizations that come out, right? Even even age or sex or anything like that could contribute and could shape kind of the way that on average people are motivated. So it's pretty interesting. One thing, there was one particular current event one of you talked about, and I just realized, another thing that we ought to think about, because I had a similar impression about something, but in a bit of a different direction. Some of these things were very vulnerable to being manipulated with, right? So if there's especially a persuasive, maybe it's, persuasion is often like visual and fear type persuade, like those types of things are the most persuasive on average. So if you see something that's scary, it's very visually scary, I don't know, like a raging fire, for example, and then that's associated with something, that could tend to trigger your moral foundation. Like that might be a spot where you're most vulnerable to manipulation in general. So just some food for thought there, because it's something that the information we're exposed to can be manipulated. We might think it's from something, especially when there's like some hot current event like today, like the Flint water crisis or something. And I could tell you all about the Flint water crisis. Whatever that hot topic might be, there's room for just ignorance, and there's room for bad actors, and room for people that are like really care a lot about it. And so they saw some information, they're going to share it. And this is kind of a dynamic of social media too. And that might only be part of the picture, and it might be a picture, a literal picture or a video from some other time, and it's just been pretending like that's today's problem. So as you navigate the world of who knows what's going on, just give at least other people that are seeing things, differently, some thought to like, oh, maybe they're seeing something different, right? Maybe they are experiencing different information, different moral values, and something struck their heart chord differently than it did yours, right? It might be a way to better relate to people. Okay, so a lot of this is coming specifically from Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. Also wanted to comment, in there, and a couple of you commented on this, and I think we sort of talked about it. This stupid cartoon here that's trying to describe what somebody thinks is equality versus equity. And I think the more accurate would be to, chop somebody's legs off instead. The thing you don't realize whenever you see this cartoon anywhere is these three people are just trying to get free stuff. They haven't paid for tickets. So they're actually we shouldn't even be giving them any attention for this activity that they're doing. Like it's all kind of nonsense, right? You should just build the fence higher. That's the answer. They're not supposed to be doing that. Because then the people who paid to go to the game get to go to the game. Hot take you've never heard, right? So keep that in mind. Anytime you see this, it might not even be on accident. I don't know. Or if it is an accident, it's a little telling that what's happening here is a criminal enterprise, and we're trying to figure out how to do that in a fair manner, or whatever. There's all sorts of other problems with it. I forgot I was gonna ask you to see what you thought might be wrong with the thing, but yeah, I don't know. And the other thing I wanted to say is completely separately. So the book, The Righteous Mind, was also released in the UK, and I think they have a different sense of humor. So that's the cover for the UK version. Sums up the feeling of, one person values this, the other person values this. How are you feeling about it to each other? There you go. Right. Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts or anything about this? Yeah. I really respect each and every one of your thoughts and perspectives you shared. So thank you for that. That was really cool. Okay, so onward then. So as we try to identify some sort of problem within a community, as we specifically start thinking more and more about water and wastewater treatment, well, partly we ought to be open to the fact that there might be other problems going on, right? And this is something I really appreciate about amigos down in Nicaragua. Is they tend to be very cognizant of way more than just one thing, more than just water, more than just farming or economic development or anything. So a lot of times the first thing to do would be to take a site visit. If you're going to go and try to help, as an engineer in particular, you have to go and see the problem, see what's there, and so you take some sort of observational visit. If you ever work with Engineers Without Borders, that's kind of their number one thing you prepare for a site visit. You scope it out, you see what the issues are, and you identify the problems. Some of them are going to be obvious. You're going to take note of them and start tackling or start planning to tackle the obvious problems. You generally do some sort of technical evaluation, right? Okay, so here's our water source. How much would it cost to treat this properly? How much would it cost to instead dig a well? You do a technical evaluation of your options, of what's happening. And to an extent, that's something that we can help amigos with when we visit and with our projects here, is to say, okay, well, here's a particular situation. These X, Y, and Z might be things we could do about it. And for those of us going, maybe we can test some of the water quality parameters. Maybe we can produce some data to show for educational purposes. Hey, you're kind of polluting your own water by storing it in this big drum, and here you can see the bacteria growing, and that's what makes you sick, kind of thing. You might do some sort of a public health study, perhaps epidemiological, and that could all be incorporated with an observational site visit kind of thing. Another way we might identify problems is simply from community outcry. Flint water crisis was a good example of this. The community knew something was wrong, and then when a pediatrician saw elevated blood lead levels in children, she got a lot of more motivation and contacted people to really start addressing this problem and identifying the problem from a technical perspective. A lot of this, and so activism in that sense, a lot of times helps us see what the problem is. So, as we think back on, think about moral foundations and all of that, and the potential for manipulation and things, activism is an interesting topic. And I won't go too much more into it, but what I'll say is that it appears to me like in society, activism is a little bit like a pain response. So if I hurt my arm and I feel pain, right? It's sending pain signals to my brain saying, hey, something's wrong here. Let's fix that. Let's take care of it. Let's stop what we're doing. It's kind of an outcry within my body to my brain, right? It's like, problem. And I think that's incredibly important in a lot of situations. But what happens when I'm healed, but the pain is still shouting at me? Well, the pain is actually a problem, and it's distressing, and it's distracting me from everything else. So chronic pain is not helpful pain. And so it's very interesting to think about what happens to an activist group that formed to address a particular problem that was a serious problem, serious societal harm, and they were successful. Fantastic, awesome. Well, what happens to that organization? Is it typical that it's just going to dissolve and go away? It's not so typical, because people are working there and need their job, and they've been doing good, important work, right? So they're probably going to look for another problem. If we're not careful, and I think this happens at least sometimes, what happens is they start searching for problems. And if our pain is looking for reasons if our nerves are looking for a reason to shout in pain, that's not so good, right? If our body is chronically in pain, it's actually not helpful. So as we think about activism, it's both very important and potentially hazardous out of context. Does that make sense? That's the way I kind of see it. So now, I think there's good room there to progress, for an activistic organization to progress meaningfully, so long as they're very careful with and principled with their finding of problems to outcry about, right? So it's not that we ever want to get rid of the pain signal altogether. We actually really need that. It's really important. So we should never squash it, but there is a reason that if we have a surgery, we have pain medication, so we don't have a chronic pain issue come up where our nerves get a kind of a highway of signal instantiated. Okay, so just a little comment on that. Okay, so then there's data. Of course, we could take a look at data. There's a good website here. We'll pull up. I think that's where I pulled this map of projected changes in malaria incidence rates by country from 2000 to 2015. So it's kind of looking at, I think, let's see if I can read this. I think that the dark blue is improvements, the light blue is small improvements, or maybe the dark blue is big improvements, and then lighter blue is small improvements. Yellow might be making it worse, and red is very worse. In terms of how much malaria, how many malaria cases are in that area. And so we could take a look at the World Health Organization data here. I'm going to bring this on over. So they have a nice site so the Global Health Observatory data. So and I think there's plenty of other resources. I think Our World in Data is another site that's kind of just data visualization. So we might look at all sorts of things. We've got environment and health. We've got air pollution, which I don't know why that's separated from environment, but okay. So we might find, I don't know if we'll find water specifically. Water safety and water sanitation and hygiene. So we can get some summary stats here. Can take a look at different studies. Drinking water report as of September 2023. So lots of potential for data to take a look at, and we might, maybe we're specifically interested in malaria, so we can use that data to find a few hotspots to say, okay, here are the countries that really need the most help, right? So perhaps that's an approach we could use. Okay, so in 2017, there were 785 million people with not even any basic water service. Would maybe be interesting to see if that's changed to date. Also, at that time, 45% used safely managed hygiene, including, that increased about 1% per year from 2008 to 2017. So if that continues to increase by 1% per year, we might be around 50% or so safely managed hygiene. So that's encouraging progress there. So in 2016, the burden of disease for diarrheal deaths was just over 800,000 people per year. So that's a clear spot where interventions with water and wastewater treatment can really help, right? So that's almost 1 million people per year. And that's counting deaths, by the way. There's quite a bit more that would be positively impacted from simply not being sick so often, right? So if you have, if you have interventions, let's say the burden of disease here calculated in deaths, that's the number of people that we estimate were dying from diarrheal diseases, but that means there's also a lot of people that survived the diarrheal diseases, but having chronic diarrhea especially as a child, is going to stunt your growth and affect a lot of aspects, simply for nutrition, if nothing else. Okay, so we found a problem. Now what? Right. So that as we think about malaria or the diarrheal disease and stuff, what are some of the reasons, and what kind of options are we going to take? So, let's say we're looking at malaria for a moment, and we see malaria's, problem here. Is that Venezuela, I think, and Peru? Should we maximize good at all costs? Right, that's the question we kind of talked about before, and we kind of see you shaking heads no. So, what would be the reason to intervene? Let's say to do something about mosquitoes and malaria in a country. So, obvious one would be save lives, right? So, but what else? Okay. Other reasons. Why would you want to go to Nicaragua? I told you it's not a spring break trip, right? You're not going to party.
Maybe like reach for global health, like towards that goal.
Okay, so
Work towards it.
so progress. Towards goals, and the reason you want that is because the goal itself you see is good, or is like kind of what's the underlying motivation there? Is it something that you feel good about pursuing, perhaps?
Yeah. Kind of like a selfless thing, maybe.
Yeah, so something, the whole pay it forward thing, right? Free hugs, or like, little memes where you see somebody, I don't know, pays for the meal of the person behind them in the drive-thru or whatever, right? It's like there's some aspect that we see in our society that we end up, and I think this is borne out across basically all religions, and belief systems and everything. It's like we can kind of see and sense that there is something we get by doing a random act of kindness. And so that random act of kindness type of thing would apply here too, right? It's like we find some fulfillment there. We find some purpose, right? So, and when I say that, it's, it kind of goes against, sounds like it goes against a selfless act, right? And maybe you can debate that or whatever, but when we engage in something like that, we are, sacrificing something of ourselves for the betterment of others and society in general. And thankfully, this is part of why society works, is that there is a mechanism in there that gives us some positive feeling about that, right? And so maybe we could say gratification or fulfillment or something. Probably just one. What else? Yeah, so solutions for, and that definitely ties into the standard of living, but that kind of brings in like solutions to particular problems, right? And that we assume would increase the standard of living, right? And comfortable. So that would be comfort and health and all sorts of other things. Okay, anything else? So these are pretty good categories, right? So pretty general. What about, and I mean, I kind of touched on some of this a little bit, but what about a little bit more selfish reasons? You think of anything that, and maybe at a national level, would there be some sort of interest in intervening in a country?
I know it's kind of a similar thing. So some of my family are farmers, and they went to Costa Rica to promote growing rice, and be like, oh, it's such a good crop, and you can do it naturally, you'll bring more money. But they also want to bolster that rice growing economy, so they can say, hey, look, we're doing so much better, and everyone gets rice from Louisiana and not this place. So it's kind of like they're artificially inflating their competition to make themselves look good and to serve their own businesses.
Okay.
So that's like large scale things that I think.
Yeah, and so what I'm asking for here is not like the proper reasons necessarily, right? So that one's maybe a gray area potentially, but it's like what reasons might people have to intervene, right? So that's a good one for this. So some sort of economic, or we'll say economic benefits. What else?
If people are like, if their community and country is improved, they're less likely to want to leave it and go to a different country.
So some sort of stabilization, if you're concerned about immigration or perhaps, and that same line of thinking would extend towards just volatility in a region, right? So if the people are doing better, there's going to be less instability in the region, perhaps, right?
Yeah, and they would also like, if the country is self-sufficient, then they don't have to rely on outside help.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll say stability and self-sufficiency. That's good. Yeah, and so we can probably start to imagine and just, I don't know, watch different movies that have geopolitical themes that are, whether fiction or non, we'll start finding more reasons why random interventions might be happening, or might be a farce for some, I don't know, cartel type situation or mafia, who knows what. we can imagine a lot of potential reasons that maybe are given but are not actually positive reasons, but also quite a lot of positive reasons to do so, right? Okay, so what might be some reasons against? And I'm starting this by maybe they don't want the intervention, right? That's certainly possible. If you ever received unwanted advice, yeah, sometimes you don't want that, right? It might be good advice, but you weren't asking for it, and that's up to you, right? There's a lot of reasons you might not want advice from somebody. You don't want them influencing your decisions or something,
That makes me think, isn't there like a tribe out there that's really, they're on an island or something? They don't have technology at all or something like that. And people try to go and introduce things to them, and they like.
You died, so it's where Christianity or maybe really got killed.
Yeah.
The funny part is that they shot an arrow at him, and everyone said, "Hey, you should not go back." They said, "Nah, I'm gonna go back. I want them to know about God."
Yeah.
I think that's on Amazon.
Yeah.
I think there's just some people just too disconnected with the outside world. They don't
Yeah.
They would say no.
Yeah.
So,
They also, I think that island maybe had been like colonized at one point, and it brought a lot of like diseases, and then like a lot of their population died. I didn't take botanist in high school,
Oh, neat.
and so like I think they like are really against, like they're like a protected island, so you don't go there.
Yeah.
Because the diseases and immunity that we have these days would
Yeah.
them out.
So there's a lot there that you guys just said. So great example and great things. And by the way, do we fault the people of that island at all for that? No, right? So you can't imagine anything that's more prejudicial, probably racist, probably, anything anti anyone but them. It's so insular. But we recognize that in this case, we actually affirm that, right? Because they're being self-protective, right? So if you think about it, it might be a little mind-blowing to say, oh, we recognize even as a society that like this group of people just does not want to be touched, and we sense that that's hope the building's okay. We sense that there's something okay about that, right? Of course, we don't tolerate that type of behavior from a lot of people groups, within society, but we recognize there's some separate society there, right? And a separateness that makes all of that okay. Anybody that doesn't look like them, anybody that's outsider, should be shot with an arrow. And we to the point where we all know it outside, and they've made it clear to anybody that is approached, to the fact that that individual, I remember reading about that story too. It's like warned a million times by everybody who knew anything about it, and against all the best advice, he made some foolish decisions, right, and was killed for it. And even Christians will mock that, right? There might be some other feelings there too, but like that's something that we kind of can appreciate. Yeah, that was clear that was not the right thing. And it's okay that group of people are going to do that. That's just kind of interesting. So in some sense, so being insular or self-protective. Nicaragua, for example, I think I mentioned to you guys, they've done a lot to get rid of foreign influence, especially in the NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, so Amigos for Christ, for example. So they've made it difficult for NGOs to maintain their status there and keep working there. There's a lot more legal hurdles, and it's got to the point where they will reject any money coming in from the U.S. So I was talking with them about, hey, maybe we can apply for this grant, set up a small water and soil quality lab down there, a few instruments, kind of like make something of this. Let's maybe try to apply for that. And then once they talked with their lawyers, they're like, oh no, we can't do that. That's U.S. money. can't even touch it. And so they're kind of doing that as well, right? So we recognize sometimes there's some reasons against, and so that protective aspect might be it. What else?
I'm thinking of certain people, like, this is more on an individual scale.
Yeah.
Certain people choose to, like, live a homeless lifestyle.
Mhm.
Like, that's popular in Colorado. I don't know why, but people are just like, I don't want to own things.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's religious or what, but that's the thing.
Yeah, so some people it's just simply choice, not like choice to live what we might perceive as a low quality of life or something that needs intervention, but they've actually chosen that lifestyle, right? And they're not interested in that. And honestly, I think we need to respect that. And maybe to the point where it's not harming other people, right? The islanders with the insular community there, there's a pretty good chance they're not going out of their way and harming anybody outside their island. And so, okay, if they were causing global conflict, we might not approve of their behavior, right? But that's not what's happening.
Another obvious reason is like why you wouldn't want to help the communities if you think you'll drain the resources without a significant change.
Yeah, so that benefit to cost ratio and also, so I'm going to split that kind of into two, and to also say like that sacrifice that's being made, like you kind of need it to have an impact, or you're making the sacrifice in hopes that there will be an impact. So if you start seeing that there's no impact, it's just being wasted, it's being squandered, or corruption is taking all the money to whoever, it's like, okay, maybe we're not going to do that, right? Resource drain or waste. That's a good point. What else?
I think one reason against could also just be like safety. Sometimes, like, I know there's certain places where when people try to bring these like boats of resources or whatever, it'll get like hijacked by pirates. And so that could be like a reason against it.
Yeah, and there's a couple examples today, right? So it's like, why not stop on the side of the road? Well, safety concerns, right? I remember I was probably in grad school, and I was commuting back to my family that grew up outside of Atlanta. And I was driving on the interstate. It's kind of just outside of Atlanta. And I saw some guy walking along the highway, and I just figured I didn't have too much better to do. And so I stopped and offered him a ride. And I gave him a ride, and several, 5-10 miles later, dropped him off somewhere. And he like warned me to be careful not to do that kind of stuff, because you never know. And I was like, all right, thanks. So I don't know what that was about exactly, but it was just kind of amusing that like I did him a favor and he was warning me for my own safety, right? But you'll also find that like that's that particular dynamic might be different in different places. I think hitchhiking in Europe is pretty common these days, and 50 years ago is pretty common in the States. So yeah, I don't know. It's but definitely some legit concerns there, and you don't want to expend all of your resources by getting killed for trying to help somebody, right?
I feel like I can go both ways too. Like sometimes people might reject help out of fear for their safety.
Yeah.
I think it depends some location, because if it's like on the interstate, they're not pulling over.
Yeah.
But if it's like in the woods, you see a person like have blood on them.
Yeah. So it's definitely situational. So in Abby, you made a good point here. So that's both personal. Well, let me write that different. So we'll say self and or other. And by that I mean, like, for example, that self-protection that the tribes people there were doing, right? So that they might have concern for their own safety, and so they'll refuse help. We might have concern for our own safety, so we refuse to help, right? And definitely that might be situational for like, what kind of help is needed here? Is it, what's the context, and is this a reasonable thing to do, right? Okay.
I guess another thing would be like, if you're willing to fight something like at all costs, do anything it takes to solve it, it's pretty likely that you're gonna introduce different problems, and like you just have to weigh like the difference between them. Like,
Yeah.
at least with malaria, if you want to fight against malaria at all costs, you go spread DDT everywhere. But that just introduces a bunch of different problems.
Yeah. And exactly, right? So what you just hit on is all costs. Well, what are those costs? We do need to consider those, because if that's your approach, we should at least be ready to handle those costs, right? So kill all the mosquitoes. What other ecological impacts is that going to have? Are we going to collapse the bat population and therefore this other population? What costs are there? So too much or perhaps hidden costs. Important to consider or to identify, to think about. Like that. Anything else?
I guess to hit on like the motivation is also ability. Like if we go over to a different country and start all these great things, and then we leave, then have that motivation to continue it, but also have the ability and like just to be able to continue to get through life.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'm going to call that sustainability in terms of, let's say we do put in a drinking water well or something. Can the community sustain that? What happens when the pump breaks? Because it's going to break eventually, right? Or what happens there? And that comes to skills, that comes in terms of other resources, money, or availability of repair materials, all of that. Yeah, that's a good one. So if we recognize we can't, then, and I think I had a case. I might have this in one of our other slides in a future lecture, but I think I recall a case where there was some sort of intervention. It was like might have been a well or something like that. Nice fancy setup, infrastructure of some sort, and then it broke pretty quick after, and whatever NGO had arrived, they just showed up and put it all there and then left, right? And then it broke. So what are they going to do? Well, it ended up becoming the town latrine. Just people literally peed on it, right? Just like that's what its use was, as a waste of a lot of money, but also, just that resources. And it definitely was not something that promoted dignity or anything like that for the community, right? So definitely, is it something that's actually meaningful? So if we see that it's not meaningful, so I guess for reasons not, I should probably put this on 4. So we'll say not sustainable if we recognize it's not sustainable, right? Okay, great. Great thoughts. Thank you. Okay, so this is I think I touched on a little bit, but I heard this phrase, ARP, advice requires permission, right? And I found that I resonated with that pretty well. And we talked about that a little bit in terms of, how many times have you had somebody giving you advice you weren't looking for? And I think this is probably the tension of every teenager with parents ever, right? They end up in a situation where they're still supposed to be being advised by the parent, because that's the parent's job, is to advise them and train them in a decent direction, right? But at some point they're becoming adults. We all go through that phase and we're becoming an adult, and we start thinking in part like an adult, not all the way yet, but that starts as we're teenagers, right? And so as we're beginning to get to that point, we're starting to sometimes think like, no, I don't want your advice. But so we can, I think probably most people can relate with that tension. And you can also pretty easily see when people are crossing your boundaries if you're starting to feel like, yeah, I didn't really want that advice, and I didn't need it or didn't ask for it, right? So please stop giving it. might be the type of person to not spend as much time with or something, or to hold a bit of a boundary. Okay, so there's some other things to think about just in general. There are communication barriers. It's kind of an obvious one, language. But there are also cultural barriers sometimes. If I can put you on the spot, Eben, maybe you can share a little bit about what kind of cultural differences you found since you've been here about a year now from Ghana. Anything surprise you culturally, or anything that would surprise, we might find surprising in Ghana? Uh-huh.
dress is very different in Ghana. Maybe just wear some, we have African prints, we wear, and that's what we usually wear now. And anyhow, we speak faster. So sometimes we put graphs and stuff in what you are saying. And also mostly when you speak, you look exactly to the person's eye. In Ghana, we hardly look straight into the person's eye when we are talking.
Mhm.
Yeah, you are slightly, but you don't see something.
So eye contact is different. So is it a disrespectful thing to make eye contact?
It's not bad. Mostly when you're talking to chiefs, those who rule and stuff, they don't usually look.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So if you were to make eye contact and not do that to somebody in a position of authority, you might be worried that might be disrespectful, or they might find it disrespectful. Yeah. So thank you. That's exactly the type of things, that we would be totally unaware of going to some place where we have no context, right? And so that ties in very well with both language. If I start talking really fast, I'm not very good at talking really fast, but maybe I can try real quick. I think that's the first time I've ever tried to talk real fast. That could make a difference if we're going really fast and the people we're trying to talk to, maybe we have a translator, maybe they know some English, but it's been a while, if we try to start talking to you in French or Spanish or something, how many of you are going to catch it on real fast? So definitely some potential language barriers, cultural barriers, even things like gestures. So if I were to ask you, give me a gesture with your hand to say, hey, come here. Go ahead and do that. Yeah, go ahead and just make it visible, right? So what would you do? Reach out your hand and show me. Come here. Okay, so in some cultures, saying hey, come here or come here, that's actually quite offensive. It's a lot like the book we saw. It means kind of that. And so instead, you do this. Say, come here. And I think in a lot of Latin American countries, I think that's the case too. So watch for that. I mean, even something I've seen in Louisiana, it's not quite gesture, but there's a phrase, come see. I hear that, not being native to Louisiana, and I say, oh, what am I looking at? I'm going to come over there and I'm going to look at what you're looking at. I'm going to see what you wanted me to see. But apparently, and you guys are all laughing, that just means come over here, right? And it's usually hey, come see, or come see, right? So even that's probably not much of a barrier at all. But it's interesting we can see that, right, and see that aspect of culture and the richness there too, of just seeing how different cultures present and exist, how people show up in the world. Leadership is another aspect in terms of having good communication and working on solving problems, especially in communities. I mean, even Evan sort of highlighted, oh yeah, if we have some leader, chief type person or something in a community, how do we interact with them, and how do we appreciate that? How do we answer to that? How do we navigate that? And what are the expectations there? Do we have somebody that is taking that leadership? Do we have leadership in a community that can sustain this project? Really important things there. Ownership, so if community is taking ownership of that, we talked a bit about that. And all of these sort of are tying into sustainability of some sort of project. And of course, then that needs to be managed, so that project management as well there is kind of directly involved as well. Okay. Any barriers you pop into mind for you? So a lot of these might also kind of just simply could be summed up by expectations. You know, if you get a chance to go abroad, or even, you know, for me, visit Louisiana, or for you, maybe visit, I don't know, Michigan or somewhere. It's like the expectations of how you interact with people can be different, right? So it's navigating that and appreciating that there's going to be some differences there is a good thing. Okay, so I want to wrap up with this ethical quandary here, and this kind of relates to a lot of, in a way, a lot of what we were talking about. So, how many of you know the trolley problem quandary? Okay, some of you, well, probably most all of you. So, trolley problem goes: there's a trolley heading down the tracks. You happen to be standing by a lever, and you know that lever can divert the trolley to take this way instead of the way it was going, which was this way. Now, the thing is, fortunately, this is fictitious, right? But in the fictitious example, we have 5 people that are going to die if the trolley continues this way. Apparently, it doesn't have brakes. You know, it's an unfortunate situation. Or you could change the lever, so that's going to happen. Or you could swap the lever so that it runs over one person instead, right? The quandary is, if you move that lever, you've caused that person to die, right? You have intervened and caused harm in doing so. Now, I think there's a lot of philosophy and a lot of ethics, and you can probably go to consequentialism and versus deontological stuff, meaning kind of like, are you basing it on the foundation that do no harm, or are you basing it on like how many deaths are involved, kind of thing? I think the clear answer is this is an annoying, stupid problem. Let's not think about that, right? That obviously that's the answer, you know, because you just try, because in reality you'd probably try to jam the thing in between so it would just crash and not hit anybody. You'd probably not be making that exact choice. At any rate, that's you know, they limit that, and they can't say that, so we just say, okay, this is a frustrating problem, and I don't care about, you know, your stupid philosophy, ethics. But I'm going to make us think about it for a moment. You know, there's an additional quandary of sorts. If you're walking by a pond, let's say it's a deep pond, and somebody's flailing about, potentially drowning, are you obligated to help? I see some no's. Anybody feel obligated? So there's a danger involved with trying, right? So it really goes a lot back to the slide we were talking about, the pros and cons for doing so, right? I think that in most common laws, you're not legally obligated to help somebody in that situation. Now, you might feel moral obligation, right? Moral foundations and everything, and that might be a good thing to do. But most legal systems recognize there's a risk of self-harm, and it could be even a simpler thing of like even just getting your shoes wet to try to help somebody. You know, there is a, you know, again, kind of stupid trolley problem type case to be made that people should not be obligated legally to help if they perceive potential harm. So it's a weird situation, and of course, you know, I think most of us would feel pretty motivated if you were able to save somebody and it just cost you a shoe. Seems like a pretty good risk reward, right? But it does also say something about, well, what about an impoverished country? And we touched on this a little bit earlier with, well, to what extent do I expend all my resources, right? Because if we say, oh, there's this starving child, let me give them some food, that's, you know, super motivating, right? And super, like a great morals providing us motives to do so. But can we do that with every single starving child in the world? No, there's no way. We would have expended everything. So in a way, we can't take it as an obligation, and we can't let other people obligate us play a savior. If people are trying to do so, that's actually probably psychological abuse. That's probably manipulation. Now, to point at problems and to identify problems and recruit help to solve a problem, I think is the better way to do that, right? And the care and concern about starving children would be a good thing in that sense, to say, hey, look what good we could do here. But we also need to make sure we're in pretty good alignment with the good reasons to do so. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of the ethics. We'll talk about water quality next time. And if for any of the travelers, group up here for 2 minutes, if you could. And otherwise, we'll see you guys on Tuesday.